So what's going to be the real score on Mr. Trump and his cabinet? Our panelists weigh in. Joining us in our Beijing studio, Mr. Ye Hailin, who is from the National Institute of International Strategy under the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. Welcome, sir. Also joining us in Iowa, United States, we have Timothy Hagel, Professor of Political Science at the University of Iowa. Professor, it's wonderful to see you again. Also in Washington, D.C., we are having Morgan Muchnick, who is the founder of the M2 Group, a public and government affairs firm. He's also an experienced Republican strategist involved in numerous presidential and congressional campaigns. Welcome as well, Mr. Muchnick. Let's go to Professor Hagel first. Professor Hagel, have you ever seen something like this? A Secretary of State have to go public and talking about, I didn't call my president a moron. Well, the president, in his personal tweets, have been going against the rhetorics of the Secretary of State. Professor Hagel, you are more experienced in politics than I am. Help me to understand.
It's very unusual, there's no doubt about it, and that's partly due to Trump's character, his style. Some people that don't like him as much would characterize it in more negative terms, of course, but it's not something we're used to. When you have those kinds of conversations in a very intense environment, a lot of times they're public or private, but we see with this administration that there are many more people who seem to be willing to leak this sort of information, and a press that's very willing to try to publicize it in various ways in terms of the timing and things that are going on. But you're correct that in terms of having a Secretary of State have to come out and say that, no, I didn't call the president a bad name, is very unusual.
All right. Well, Mr. Muchnick, if the professor is too academic when it comes to historical analysis, what about you? You're a strategist coming from the Republican Party. You work for the presidential debate. You work for the congressional campaigns. What about you?
Yeah, I mean, I do think it's absolutely true that this is not the norm. But this is not the norm for either political party. You know, this isn't the norm for Democrats. This isn't the norm for Republicans. President Trump, and people have to keep in mind, he is one single motion flipped the traditional script on its, flipped it on its head. He is his own animal. He's his own animal when it comes to his communication strategies. He's his own animal when it comes to his policy decisions. He is someone that we've never seen, at least in the era of mass media. So we have to just, unfortunately or fortunately, depending on where you stand, we have to accept that there is going to be a certain higher level of political tumult that exists under this type of leadership. Whether it's good or bad, it'll be outcome-oriented. We'll look at it later and see if it worked or didn't work, because the process is certainly not an elegant one. But we'll have to see whether the outcome is a positive one or not, and history will judge.
Well, Mr. Muchnick, it's a very interesting word you use. The process is not necessarily an elegant one. At this point, it seems a lot of referring to that point. For example, the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee of the Congress, also a Republican, coming out and suggesting about his very clear stance between these two men, President Trump or Secretary of State. If you have Republican leadership that strong, that public talking about it, of course we're only talking about one gentleman. There are many others who also indicate in very different ways their most appropriate ways to mention about this. What kind of party are we seeing, and is there going to be any common ground, Mr. Muchnick, between the Republican Party and President Trump? I know you want to say something. Please.
I do, because I think you touched upon, the most important point that I believe is too often forgotten in a lot of the more traditional discussions in politics and policies of the day. We have to remember that President Trump is not a traditional Republican. He is far more liberal in general, not across every issue, than most traditional conservative Republicans. He is his own animal. So right now there are three separate and distinct political organizations that promulgate public policy in Washington, D.C. We have the Trump and his Trump, let's say, quote, Trump Republicans. We have the traditional or more establishment Republicans, and then we have the Democratic Party writ large. So people have to always remember that Trump is not a traditional Republican president simply trying to move his own party in Congress down the road towards individual legislative agendas or initiatives. He's doing things his own way, against the will of his own party, far more often, it seems to me, than even the quote-unquote opposition party, which is a Democratic party.
Right. Professor Hagel, before I go to the Chinese guests, I need to really ask you about this. To what extent do you think the three quote-unquote forces in Washington mentioned by Mr. Muchnick are really going to make the decisions, particularly when it comes to foreign relations, when it comes to geopolitical issues? We heard about the Iran issue. We also heard about the tweets of President Trump regarding the DPRK issue that the Secretary of State had been talking about, which is through negotiation, through dialogue, he's trying to say. So what are we going to see? Which force is going to be the leading force? That's what we're really interested from outside China, United States rather.
Well, I'd like to basically tag on to what Mr. Muchnick was saying, is that, again, to use his phrase, Trump is a different animal. He's an outside, non-establishment kind of person. So he has a different style. And I think I also agree in terms of we'll have to wait to see what the history of this ends up being. In other words, what the results end up being. But the process itself is going to be quite different, and we've seen that all along. To a certain extent, it seems that in foreign policy area that President Trump has played the bad cop, so to speak, to members of his administration, sometimes including Secretary Rex Tillerson, playing the good cop. Sometimes that doesn't work very well, plus Trump has his own way of dealing with his personnel, suggesting some conflict there as well. So we basically have to wait and see how it all comes out in the end, because again, the process itself is not going to be particularly pretty.
Having heard two American colleagues, Mr. Ye, you are here scratching your head, trying to figure out what's going to be the road ahead. It's very confusing to the Chinese too, probably even more. So what about that? I mean, Mr. Ye, what is China's judgment? Which force is likely to really work when it comes to foreign policy?
We should tell the differences between the insider and outsider.
Okay.
Our two American co-workers, they are the insiders. They see the whole process, maybe rational, maybe irrational, but the question is, they care about why it happened, because they want to fix the problem.
Okay.
We are the outsiders. We only care about the consequence, how it will impact to our interest. So we are not so care about the why, because, you know, even though we can figure out what's happened, what's the reason,
knowing the
we can't do
why,
anything.
You could also figure out what it's likely to be the
question is
impact.
that we need to figure out how it will work to play the role on us.
Okay,
so that's the
if
key
we
issue.
go specifics, Mr. Ye, let's go to some specifics. Chinese President Xi Jinping have very close ties with President Trump. They've been talking on the phone for several times. That's unprecedented frequency we talk about. And also you see the two leaders. I mean, Mr. Trump, he's the President of the United States, right? He represents the United States outside his country. So they meet quite often in multilateral occasions. Secondly, Chinese ambassador, Mr. Cui Tiankai, to the United States, is a very strong ambassador, have very good ties with different walks of life in the United States, including with the Trump administration and the White House as well. Thirdly, you see the Chinese Foreign Minister, Mr. Wang Yi, and the Secretary of State, Mr. Tillerson, very closely working together regarding also the latest visit by Secretary of State Tillerson to China. You see these two are on many issues together when it comes to discussion. So will this be able to help China solve the myth that our American colleagues are trying so hard to figure out? Foreign policy, who's going to make the decision?
I don't think so. I think we have too many information channels. Maybe we're trapped by too many informations. But talking about China and the U.S. relationship, I don't think the personal issue is the crucial or the most important factors for the bilateral relationship. I think that these two countries are great power, big power. They have some nature or essential factors for the bilateral relationship. No matter why how the leadership's relationship between two countries, all the ambassadors issue, all the foreign affairs ministers, they played a very important role. But the nature is still there. So this is the differences between the relationship between the China and the U.S., or the relationship between the DPRK and the U.S. Because the DPRK will carefully read any even teeny little information released by the DC and make the judgment.
Okay.
But for China, it's different.
Here is some very tiny, quote-unquote, information coming from Washington, D.C. President Trump and Mr. Martinik was talking to the press before he going into a dinner with the military personnel of the Pentagon. And he said something big is going to happen. This is the calm before the storm. Okay, the press got crazy about this. What is the storm you're talking about, sir? Is it about DPRK? Is it about Iran? Is it about something else? Of course, Mr. Trump earlier as a reality show star wouldn't elaborate on that. But the thing is, to what extent can you trust this president when it comes to his words? Because sometimes it does come true. However, to what extent could you just brush it off and seeing him as a personality, in your words, an animal of his own?
Well, first, let me just very quickly touch upon our previous guest and what he
Sure.
said. I do think, with respect to the bilateral relationship between the United States and China, just like with any other country in the world, this president is not burdened by the traditional norms of domestic or foreign affairs, quite frankly. And that's good and it's bad, depending on where you come from. That means that in other countries, China, in this sense, for purpose of this discussion, has a very unique opportunity to potentially rewrite and rebuild some of the traditional norms that, and the tensions that have existed between our two countries, because the other guest was correct. China is the growing power, second only to the United States, with the leveling off and the tailing off of the Russian power. And the United States is still the strongest, biggest, most powerful economic and military power in the world. China, I think, and the United States is a very unique chance to potentially reset the sort of silly phrase Hillary Clinton used once about with Russia. But this time I think there's a real chance to reset some of the relationships and the norms that are in place. Now quickly, with that very cryptic comment about President Trump made about the calm before the storm, in some ways this is his brilliance with respect to communication strategies. He just, in one or two sentences, put myriad American adversaries on notice. DPRK, Iran, many other areas in the world that we are struggling with. And now all of a sudden, all of the foreign intelligence analysts and the like from all these other countries are panicked and struggling. And within an hour or two, there might be some announcement about maybe something we all see coming with respect to possibly the Iran sanctions thing. And my strong hunch is does not mean we're about to launch some sort of preemptive strike on the DPRK. But I do understand that this can cause quite a bit of consternation for numerous countries around the world, and I think that's exactly what the president wants.
Professor Hagel, the communication strategy or real geopolitical strategy, how can you unveil the curtain to see the real picture if, of course, there is a real picture? Professor Hagel.
Well, that's a good question, and you have different people on different sides of the issue saying, well, yes, this is a brilliant communication strategy. Trump's detractors would see it as being less so, more chaotic, more erratic. I saw some people use that term. And it's really hard to tell sometimes, and as you were indicating before, sometimes we maybe can't take Trump at his word literally, that he is just sort of throwing things out. But to a certain extent, it does seem to be part of a strategy to, if not actually institute chaos, at least shake things up a little bit. That certainly Trump wants to shake up the Republican establishment to try to get things done. That was one of the hallmarks of his campaign. And to a certain extent, unfortunately, that's going to affect our fellow countries, China and DPRK, Iran, whatever it happens to be, to shake them up a little bit. And again, depending on your perspective, as Mr. Mushnick was saying, that can be a good thing or that can be a bad thing. But to the extent that perhaps things aren't going the way that either the United States or other countries would like for whatever reason, whether it's trade or military issues or other economic issues, that it's maybe time to shake up the apple cart, so to speak, and see if we can put things together in a different way. And I think that was a very good positive spin in terms of saying that China has the opportunity to help rewrite a relationship. That's the positive way of looking at it, but perhaps it's a little uncomfortable at the time, for the time being.
Well, Professor Hagel, you got that right. At this point, Mr. Ye, You know, there is the instant strategy, whether it is in Chinese history or in Greece history, something like divide and conquer. That could be a strategy when you're planning geopolitical goals.
Yeah.
But you see a Washington that is so divided that it could hardly be conquered, quote unquote, in a way. So with this picture, what is the most pragmatic approach China could have? Of course, we're not excluding other countries. I mean, what could be this approach that would really work? Mr. Ye, I mean, you've been working in the area for decades. What is your suggestion?
I think China will pay less attention on the communication strategy adopted by Donald Trump, President Donald Trump, because firstly, after all, the most component of such kind of the communication strategy is on Twitter, and in China we can't access to the Twitter. So the Twitter is, we have our WeChat, we don't use the Twitter. So that's the one reason for China should pay less attention on that. And secondly, I think China should pay more attention on the nature of this bilateral relationship, because after all, these are two big global power. They have a lot of the very crucial connection between the two countries instead of the two leaders.
Right.
The two leaders, their communication can put a lot of color into this relationship, but not necessarily change the nature of this relationship. So I think China should come down and carefully enjoy all the political show in D.C., just like we really enjoy the playing the playing horse.
Well, gentlemen, at least the three of us, I mean the four of us are enjoying all of this conversation so far. There's another thing that we need to enjoy, that is, what are we talking about, Professor Hagel, at this point? You know, on the one hand, we are saying, well, Washington, there is division. But we know very clearly, as a professor of politics, it really depends on how much you push things forward, right? How much you got things done. President Trump, if he wants to rally the other parts of the Republican Party, he has to get things done. He hasn't get much things done. And when it comes to China issue or China-related issue, he has to get things done. But the thing is, how is he going to get things done? About what things to be done? Professor Hagel, what is likely to be your assessment here?
I agree completely, and that's one of the things that they've been talking about here in the United States in terms of determining whether President Trump's administration will be a success or not, or even the Republican Congress that now controls Congress, is whether they get things done. And here we've been primarily focusing a lot on the domestic issues, whether it's health care or tax reform now, and there's a concern as to whether the Republican Congress will actually get things done, put something on President Trump's desk to get it signed. Well, of course, it's not just domestic issues, but of course international issues as well, whether it's with, for our perspective, it was with Iran or the DPRK, but even trade with China and our relationships with China as well. That this is certainly something that Donald Trump needs to achieve. Now, some of these things he can maybe achieve or improve on without Congress necessarily, but again, he's got to start in many instances with Congress, and he's shaking them up. He's getting some dissension going as, again, a way to perhaps try to find a different way, because the way that had been going wasn't working. Things weren't getting done. Now, part of that was, again, a divided government under President Obama, but even now, with Republicans controlling the White House and Congress, things don't seem to be getting done, or at least not as quickly as what many people would like. And again, that's Trump's style, is to try to shake things up and find a way to get those things done, whatever it happens to be.
Mr. Marchinek, if when it comes to strategies, let's just say political strategies back at home, what would DPRK issue mean for President Trump, quote unquote, to get things done? And what kinds of result do you think get things done through what means would win him big marks?
Well, any war that President Trump would feel like he needs to launch between now and 2018, well, any time, you know, a war is a disaster, and it's bad for the world, and it's bad for everybody. The problem is, well, the unique, interesting opportunity for China is if the United States and China working together could come to an actually pretty solid resolution, might be the wrong term, because I don't really see an actual resolution in play for generations, but some reasonable fix to the immediate threat from North Korea to the United States, with China taking the lead and taking an active role, would help President Trump immensely from a political point of view, and I think would go light years towards cementing a much warmer working relationship between President Trump and China. And I do think before someone mentioned about, I think your Chinese guest, that this sort of political theater that we watch but doesn't really affect the relationship, I do think that this President Trump, is different. I think that personal relationships matter far more to him than any American president than I have ever possibly known. I think he holds grudges. I think if he finds someone who really likes, I think he goes out of his way to champion the efforts for that person. So I do think that this is a little bit more, again, all the traditional rules, or most of the traditional rules of political analysis, really aren't in play. And that's where I feel like everyone's gotten this president wrong for a long time. During the primary process, during the election process, and even up until now, I think all the traditional standard rubric and processes we use to analyze and predict really haven't come to pass. Okay. And lastly, I do think that this president needs to work with Congress to get some legislative wins. Because if he just does nothing but shake things up without getting tangible wins, it's going to be very problematic.
All right. Mr. Ye here, I mean, it's complicated, right? Yeah. We all know that, because you got someone who's trying to shake up Washington in his own style, whether it works or not, whether it bears positive results or not. But here's the thing, Mr. Ye, what can China do? I mean, at this point, DPRK issue, it's a concrete example. China has its own priorities when it comes to national interest. It wants to have a peaceful region in its neighborhood. Having a regime change is not for China's good in DPRK, let's just say, because it's going to violate the peace and stability eventually in the region. So, but the United States wants to have China putting on ever more pressure on the DPRK and possibly even talking about military solutions. But that's not Chinese way, Mr. Ye. So fundamentally, can China and the United States work together? Doing a president that's personal favor is one thing, but national interests and the peace and stability in the region is the real thing.
I think theoretically, China and the United States can work together to reach the essential goal for the Korean Peninsula. That means the stability and peace and the nuclear-free zone. I would like to emphasize that there's a 2 point for China's policy on the Korean Peninsula. One is no war, another one is no nuclear. So if Americans agree, China and America can make this consensus for these 2 points policy, I think China and the United States can work together very closely. But if Americans only want to pick up the one from these 2 points, such as the nuclear-free zone or denuclearization in the DPRK, I don't think China and the United States can work very close, because obviously there's another option that Americans still keep. That's the military option. But for China, military is not an option.
It is out of the question.
Out of the
and
question.
Professor Hagel, final words from you. We got 30 seconds left for you, Professor. Your thought.
I would agree with that, certainly from China's perspective, you want to have the paramount national interest, and given your closeness to what's going on there, that you certainly don't want to have nuclear weapons in DPRK, you don't want to have war. Neither does the United States, but we also have to be concerned about our issues. Hopefully, the United States and China can come together and find that solution before it becomes something more disastrous.
Thank you so much, the three of you. Timothy Hagel, Morgan Mutnick, Ye Hailin, really appreciate it. Thank you.